The first time Clay Jessup saw her, she was tied to the back of a creaking wagon, barefoot and shivering under a burlap sackcloth dress. Dust clung to her skin like shame. The man who claimed ownership of her barked prices like she were stock, strong legs, good for hauling, quiet as a nun. And Clay, standing near the cattle pens with a sack of oats over his shoulder, felt a twist in his gut that had nothing to do with hunger. They were at the Deadwood livestock auction, where the smell of manure hung thick and men made wagers on things they had no business touching. She didn't speak, just stared out from behind matted hair, her lips split and one eye swollen. The silence of her, that was what Clay remembered most, not the bruises, not even the sick weight of watching her sold for $30 and a rifle with a cracked stock. Just that silence, so heavy it swallowed the wind. He didn't act then, not right away. He should have. He told himself that for weeks. Told himself he didn't need trouble, not on the edge of a winter that promised to be hard and gray. But something in her look, when the buyer yanked her by the wrist and she stumbled past, hit him deeper than pity. It was recognition, like she saw something in him he'd forgotten was still there. Her name was Mara. He didn't know that until months later. That same winter, Clay's herd was hit by blue tongue and he lost over half his cattle. The snow came in bitter, thick layers, and the roof of his barn caved in under the weight. He lived alone on the edge of Sand Creek Canyon, where the wind howled like a widowed coyote and men came only when they wanted something. He didn't drink much, didn't talk much either. Just worked and waited, keeping time by the frost on his window pane. When he found her again, it wasn't by design. He'd gone into town to trade for salt pork and feed, and there she was, slumped on the stoop behind Higgins' saloon, one ankle twisted and bleeding, hair hacked short like a punishment. The same burlap dress, now so thin you could see the knobs of her spine. Her hands were red with cold and curled against her chest like wings broken at the joint. He stood a long while before speaking. "You need a doctor." She didn't answer. Just stared. "You'll lose that foot if it ain't set right." Still nothing, he left her. Walked 3 paces toward the general store, then stopped, cursed under his breath, and came back. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and carried her like something sacred, though she weighed hardly more than a sack of kindling. She didn't cry. That was what struck him. Even when he touched the twisted ankle, even when she flinched against his coat and tried not to breathe, still no sound. At his cabin, he cleaned her foot and splinted it, left food by her bed and spoke soft, like talking to a deer that might bolt at any moment. For days she said nothing. Wouldn't eat unless he left the room. Wouldn't sleep unless the door was latched. But she watched, always that, watching him split logs, boil water, mend the saddle that had come unstitched, watching with the same raw-eyed quiet as before. He didn't ask what had been done to her. Didn't want to break what little trust he'd begun to earn. Some things needed silence before they could be named. One night, the fire low and a storm knocking against the shutters, she whispered something, a single word. "Mara." He looked up from the chair by the hearth. She didn't repeat it, just stared into the flames like she'd spoken a spell. But he heard it, and from that night on, he used it. "Mara, you hungry?" "Mara, snow's easing up." "Mara, need help with that." She didn't answer often, but she stayed. And slowly, like frost lifting from fields, something in her started to thaw. He built her a cot near the stove. Gave her the spare quilt stitched by his sister long gone east, showed her how to grind corn and where to set the traps for rabbits. She didn't speak much, but her hands learned. Quick, careful, precise. She took to work like it might save her life. One morning, she brought in a pile of firewood without being asked. Her limp was still bad, but she carried it like penance. He looked at her then, not at the bruises or the scar that ran behind her ear, but at her eyes. Clear, brown as creek water, steady. He nodded. She didn't smile, but something in her face changed, just a flicker of ease. Winter passed like a slow knife, carving silence into something bearable. They lived beside each other, not as man and servant, not as master and mule, but something quieter. Companions, maybe, survivors. Clay didn't try to own her. And she, in her own time, began to belong in ways no deed could ever claim. By spring, when the snow had thinned and green began to edge the hills, Mara laughed for the first time. It came sudden, sharp as a bird call. She was skinning a rabbit and the guts spilled wrong and startled her, and she laughed like someone remembering how. Clay froze, knife in hand, and smiled without meaning to. She glanced up, then quickly away. But he'd seen it. That sound. That flash of something whole. It didn't mean she was healed. Wounds don't vanish in a season. But it meant something had begun. And Clay, for the first time in years, began to hope. Spring brought the thaw, and with it came the rot. Things buried under snow emerged pale and half-decayed, animal bones, a rusted boot, the smell of things that died in silence. Clay plowed the fields while the soil was still wet, sleeves rolled past his elbows, boots sunk deep. Mara followed behind with a bucket, collecting stones he turned over, her hands chapped and blistered but sure. She spoke more now, though still rarely. Her words came slow, like a creek learning to run again after ice, not stories. Not yet, but practical things. That fence won't hold, or we're low on salt, or simply rain coming. And always she was right. She watched the sky the way some men watched scripture. It wasn't comfort, not exactly, but it was rhythm. Morning coffee boiled over black beans, laundry beaten against rocks, the quiet clink of spoons. She took to humming sometimes, soft tunes without words, as if memory had been stripped of language but kept the tune. He never asked what she remembered. One afternoon, Clay rode out to check the far pasture. When he returned, the henhouse had been raided, coons, likely, and feathers were everywhere. Mara stood barefoot in the mud, blood on her arms, a broken broom in hand. 3 chickens huddled behind her alive. She didn't speak, just held her stance, breath shallow, eyes wild. Clay dismounted slow, hands open. "You did good," he said. She didn't look at him, but her shoulders eased just enough. That night she let him sit nearer to the stove while she stitched a torn shirt. Her hands trembled less than before. Then came the boy. It was early May. A storm had just passed, and the world still smelled of wet earth and cedar. Clay found him on the edge of the north road, face down in the brush, ribs poking through a too small shirt. No shoes. Skin dark with dust and dried blood. 12, maybe 13. Mara stood behind Clay as he lifted the boy and laid him across the back of the mule. Her arms were crossed tight. He glanced at her, but she said nothing, not until they reached the cabin. "He's Crow," she said. Clay blinked. "You sure?" She nodded, already fetching clean rags and the kettle. "He'll stay," Clay said, mostly to the room, but Mara looked up then, sharp. "You sure?" she asked, and the echo of his own words settled between them like a shared breath. The boy's name was Edu. He didn't speak for days, ate like a ghost, barely touching the food, eyes darting to every movement. He had bruises and welts along his back, the kind made with ropes and fists. Clay guessed someone had tried to run him off or worse. He didn't ask how he'd escaped. Like with Mara, he let the story come in its own time. Mara tended to Edu without gentleness, but with care. She washed his face, cut his hair blunt at the chin, sewed him a shirt from scraps. She never touched him without warning. She never told him to speak. One night, Edu vomited from fever. Clay found Mara beside him, holding a cool cloth to his brow, whispering in a tongue Clay didn't understand. Her voice was low and certain, each word a stone placed just right. When she saw Clay, she didn't stop. Just kept speaking until the boy slept again. In the weeks that followed, the 3 of them fell into an uneasy kind of orbit. Edu carved whistles from reeds and left them on the windowsill. Mara salted meat and hung it from the rafters. Clay built a new fence with posts scavenged from the old railway line. Sometimes they sat outside after supper, watching the sky turn violet. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Then one afternoon, while foraging for roots, Mara didn't come back. The sun dropped behind the canyon. Shadows stretched long and sharp. Clay saddled his horse and rode out with Edu trailing behind on the mule. They called her name, both of them, each in their own voice. He found her 2 miles east, crouched behind a boulder, arms around her knees, blood on her skirt. "Snake bit me," she said, almost casual, as if it were a chore. Edu dropped beside her, pale with fear. Clay cut the fabric above the bite and sucked the poison out, spat it into the dust and wrapped the wound tight. Then he lifted her onto his horse, though she protested. Back at the cabin, Mara burned with fever for 3 days. Clay hardly left her side. Edu took over the cooking, chopping herbs with childlike fury. He muttered something in Crow under his breath, again and again. When Clay asked, Edu only said, "Prayer for her." Mara didn't wake fully until the 4th night. Her eyes fluttered open, dry and red. "You stayed," she whispered. Clay leaned closer, his face lined with exhaustion. "Where else would I go?" Her mouth twitched, a breath like a laugh. She slept again, but easier this time. When she rose at last, thin and unsteady, Edu helped her to the porch. They sat side by side, legs swinging. Clay watched them from the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. And for a moment he saw it, what they'd become. Not family, not quite, not yet, but something near it. A shape forming in the dark, tender and raw, reaching toward the name it had not yet earned. In the hush between wind and bird call, Mara turned to Etu and said, "We'll need more kindling soon." The boy nodded, already reaching for the hatchet. Clay smiled then, just a little, the kind that stayed long after the moment had passed, and the sky above them, washed pale with morning, seemed to promise there was more to come. The summer came hard, dry and long, cracking the soil like old leather. Wells dropped low. The creek near the Jessup place narrowed to a slow, silt-choked whisper. Wind picked up most afternoons, carrying the smell of pine ash from a fire burning 3 ridges west. Mara had taken to walking the fields at dawn, skirt hitched and hair tied back with rawhide. Edu followed her some mornings, asking names of weeds, pressing seeds into his palms like questions. She taught him which roots healed and which ones burned, showed him how to watch birds for weather and how to listen to the wind like it had something to say. Clay watched from the porch, boot tapping slow against the post. They moved through the tall grass like kin, though neither spoke of such things. Kin was a word with weight. One afternoon, Clay rode into town for supplies. He hadn't gone in weeks. Didn't like the eyes folks gave when they saw the boy, or the quiet that followed Mara's name, passed in whispers like bad luck. Still, they needed salt and kerosene, a few planks for the barn roof that hadn't held since the last hail. He was halfway through loading his cart when a man stepped out from behind the livery, short, wide in the gut, with a face like a chewed boothiel. "Jessup," the man said, "that girl still with you, the one come from Higgins' place?" Clay didn't answer. "Thought so," the man went on. "Heard she ran off. Owed Higgins good money, she did. You keeping her now?" Clay turned, slow and deliberate. "She's not yours to speak of." The man's mouth twisted, but he didn't push it. Just spat in the dust and walked away. Clay drove home with his jaw clenched, knuckles white on the reins. That night he told Mara about the man, not everything, just enough. She didn't flinch, just nodded, slow. "He'll come," she said. Clay didn't answer, but he loaded the rifle that night and placed it near the door. A week passed, then another. They harvested beans, built a chicken pen, smoked fish over low coals. Edu found a wounded hawk and nursed it in secret beneath the porch. Mara let it be. She understood the need to fix what still might fly. One evening, the wind shifted, carried the smell of sweat and gun oil. Edu was the first to notice. He froze while fetching water, bucket still swinging. Mara saw it too, in the boy's shoulders. Clay stepped onto the porch with the rifle in hand. The man came at dusk, riding a swayback mare, 2 others behind him. Faces hidden under wide brims, but their silence gave them away. Men come to collect or hurt. They stopped at the gate, didn't dismount. "Jessup," the first one called. Same chewed boothiel voice. "We come for the girl." Mara stepped out beside Clay, no weapon, just her body tall and quiet and unbowed. "She don't belong to you," Clay said. "She was bought fair," the man snapped. 30 and a gun. "Got the paper." "You don't buy people," Clay said. "Not here, not anymore." The silence stretched, then the man grinned. "Fine words, but law's the law, and I got my right." "No law out here but what we make," Clay said. "You want to take her, you'll need to take us." The man's smile slipped. Then Edu stepped out too, small but fierce, holding the hawk in his arms like a knife. The hawk spread its wings, slow and silent. The man looked at Mara, then at the boy, then at Clay. He spat again. "Ain't worth the bullets." And they rode off, slow at first, then faster. Clay did lower the rifle till they were gone. That night, they sat long after supper, saying nothing. The hawk circled above once, then vanished into the dusk. Mara turned to Clay, voice barely above breath. "You didn't have to stand for me." "I did," he said. "I just didn't know it yet." And she looked at him, truly looked, the way she had the first time, eyes sharp, unsparing. But there was no fear now, no flinch, only something like beginning. Inside, Edu slept with the hawk's feather tucked beneath his blanket. Outside, the wind settled. And though no one called it home, it had become so without their permission. Quietly, piece by piece, in the shadow of wounds not forgotten but carried. The harvest came late that year, but came thick. Pumpkins fat and drowsy in the field, corn tall enough to whisper over their heads. Clay had never seen the land yield so much. He said it was the compost, the way Mara layered ashes and straw through the winter. Mara said nothing, just kept digging, sleeves rolled and hair knotted high, sweat streaking her temples. Edu ran the rows with a satchel, marking plants with ribbon, a system only he understood. He'd grown taller over summer, ribs no longer visible beneath his shirt. He still didn't speak much around strangers, but at home, words came easier. He ask questions at supper, tell short stories in Crow, then translate them himself, a little bashful at the edges. Mara always listened with her full face, like what he said mattered more than the meal between them. They took the harvest to the churchyard market in Dry Bluff. It was Mara's idea. "We'll need sugar for winter," she said, and Clay knew she meant more than sweetness. The preacher's wife gave Mara a wide berth. Some whispered, others just stared, but a few nodded polite, bought her preserves, asked after the tomatoes. When one woman leaned in and said, "Didn't expect you'd still be around after what folks say," Mara met her eyes and replied, "Neither did I." Later, Clay took Mara's hand beneath the table, just once, brief. No claim, no question, just a warmth exchanged. She didn't pull away. That night back home, Edu showed them something. Behind the barn, near the wild dogwood, he'd built a little linta with woven sticks and river stones. Inside, he'd buried feathers, bones, bits of ash, an offering. He lit a candle and sang low, a song from his grandmother's tongue, older than the rails, older than names. Mara watched with her head bowed. Clay stood at a distance, hat in hand. Afterward, Edu said, "It's for the ones we lost, the ones we didn't." Mara placed her hand on his shoulder. Clay said nothing, but stayed until the candle burned out. Days shortened, mornings crisped. Mara began carving wooden figures, small animals, horses, hawks, bears. She said her father had carved back before he drank himself hollow. She hadn't touched a blade since. But now she carved through the quiet hours, shaping grain and not into meaning. She gave Clay a coyote, its tail curled like a question, gave Etu a bird in flight. Clay began building a second room on the cabin. He didn't say why. Just hammered slow, measured careful. Mara brought him water and didn't ask. But one morning she stood in the frame and looked around, then said, "It'll need shelves." He nodded. "Already cut the wood." The door creaked then, and Edu stood watching, holding a hammer too big for his hand. "Teach me," the boy said, and so Clay taught him, not just hammer and nail, but balance, angle, what made wood sing or splinter. The room took shape in silence, but it was the kind of silence that holds music underneath. Then, in October, a traveler came through. She was thin and sunburnt, wearing a dress meant for someone richer. She rode a mule that looked half dead and carried a rifle with a broken strap. She asked for water, then for work. Clay hesitated. Mara didn't. "Let her sleep in the loft," she said. "We've got room." The woman's name was Alma. She had a sharp tongue and a limp she blamed on a mine collapse. Claimed she was heading west to find a brother she hadn't seen in 8 years. Clay didn't press. Mara didn't ask. Edu offered her his blanket without a word. Alma stayed 3 days, then 5. She helped split firewood, tanned a rabbit hide, told dirty jokes in the evenings while stirring stew. On the 6th day, she showed Mara how to shoot. "Rifles got more kick than you think," Alma warned, handing over the stock. Mara raised it, aimed once, and hit the bottle clean. Alma whistled. "You learned that at Higgins." Mara turned, eyes flint-sharp. "I learned that surviving men like him." No one laughed, but no one looked away. That night, Alma sat close to the fire. "I ain't got a place," she said, almost to herself. "Been a long time since I slept without my boots on." Mara looked at her a long time, then said, "You can stay if you work." Alma's face softened, just a flicker. "Ain't no other way I know." The Jessup place grew louder after that. More laughter, more stories. The porch held 4 chairs now. The meals stretched longer. And though no one called it family, it began to feel like one, not by blood but by need, by choosing. The leaves turned, then fell. And when the first snow came, dusting the fields like forgiveness, Mara stood at the window, arms crossed. She didn't smile, but her eyes shone, and behind her 3 others stood close, not touching but near enough. Winter settled in slow, not with violence but with patience. Snow sifted down each morning, quiet as a sigh. The land hardened, roots curling deep. Clay dug out the storm shutters while Mara lined the cabin walls with wool. Edu helped Alma trap muskrats along the river's edge, their boots crunching the iced-over grass in rhythm. Inside, the hearth never died. They kept it burning through night and day, passing each other in the half-light with steaming mugs and wordless nods. It wasn't comfort, not always, but it was known, a shape they understood now. The days grew short. Clay began carving again, small wooden tokens like Mara, though his were rougher. He left them tucked in corners. A horse for Edu's bedside, a wolf for Alma, a buffalo for Mara's windowsill. She didn't speak of it, but left one of her hawks on his pillow the next day, carved smoother than anything he'd made, wings arched like they were catching wind. Then, without warning, Mara began waking from dreams. At first it was only once, then again and again, always near the hour before dawn. Clay would hear her rise, step outside barefoot, breath clouding in the cold. He didn't follow at first. She returned each time, slipping beneath her blanket before the stove cooled. But on the 7th morning, he waited. When the door opened behind her, she didn't startle. "Don't know what I'm dreaming," she said, eyes on the horizon. "But it burns like something wants out." Clay said nothing, just stood beside her, hands deep in his coat. Finally, she looked at him. "There was a child, mine, once." He swallowed. The air tasted of smoke and frost. "I left him. I was young, poor. He cried and I left, never knew what happened after." She wasn't asking forgiveness, just placing the truth down between them like a blade. Clay said some things can't be fixed, but they can be carried. Mara turned, her face hollowed by shadow and light. "You ever leave someone?" "My brother," Clay said. "We both wanted out of the war. He took a bullet, I took a horse." Never saw him again. They stood there a long time, not touching, not speaking, just breathing side by side, letting the wind move through what had been held too long. Inside, Alma stirred in her cot, muttering something about wolves. Edu snored gently, curled under a mountain of quilts. The next day, Mara began digging near the tree line, even with the ground half frozen. Wouldn't say what for. Alma joked she was planting ghosts. 3 days later, Mara built a stone ring and placed the hawk carvings inside it. 4 of them pointed to the compass. "It's for what we lose," she said. She didn't explain. No one asked. That same week, word came of trouble in the hills. A settler family found gutted. No sign of horses, no tracks but boots. Alma came back from town pale, her rifle newly oiled. "They're saying it's Indians," she said, voice flat. Edu went still. Mara met Clay's eyes. "It's not." "I know," he said. They doubled watch that night, rotated shifts. Clay sat on the porch, rifle across his lap. Alma smoked a rolled cigarette in silence. Mara stayed up longer, mending the boy's coat, her fingers moving with remembered fury. Then a knock at the door. No one knocked here. Clay stood, gun ready. Mara stepped beside him. Edu held to Alma's coat, the hawk feather clutched in his palm. When Clay opened the door, a woman stood there, blood on her skirt, a child bundled to her chest. Her face was drawn tight with cold and fear. "They burned our wagon," she said. "We hid 2 days. Please, I have nowhere." No one moved. Then Edu stepped forward and held out his hand. The child reached for it, small fingers curling around his own. They let her in, fed her broth, gave her Alma's cot. That night Mara lay awake by the fire, her hand brushing Clay, the first touch offered in stillness. "We keep doing this," she said, "taking in the broken." Clay looked at her, eyes weary, voice low. "Maybe that's what family is." She didn't answer, but in the morning she asked the woman's name. Spring returned in sudden green, as if the earth had remembered itself overnight. Wildflowers cracked through the thawed dirt. The creek ran high and fast. Trees bent under birdsong, and the air smelled like turned soil and sap. They buried the last of the snow behind the smokehouse, where sunlight rarely reached. Edu built a wind chime from bones and tin that clattered soft against the cabin eaves. Mara planted beets and onions. Alma mended saddlebags and sang to herself in Spanish when she thought no one listened. The woman who'd knocked that winter stayed. Her name was Ruth. The child was Leela. They were quiet, wary at first. Ruth moved through the days like someone bracing for loss, always ready to flee. But when Edu taught Leela to fish with her hands in the shallows, and Mara showed Ruth how to twist cord from flax, something in their posture softened. They'd come through fire. Now they learned how to rest in the absence of it. Clay built a cradle from pine, though Leela no longer needed one. Still, he carved her name into the side, small and careful, left it on the porch. No one spoke of it, but it stayed there, filled with spare blankets and wooden toys, a sign that space had been made. By midsummer, Edu began disappearing after breakfast, returning near dusk with mud on his boots and flint in his pockets. One evening he led them out past the tree line, through a narrow trail that wound between junipers. There, in a clearing, stood what he had built, a long house of sticks and packed clay, roofed with bark. Inside, he'd painted the walls with river mud and ash, animals, spirals, a hawk in mid-flight. His home, he said, a place for memory. Mara walked the perimeter slow, then nodded once, solemn as ceremony. Alma laid her hand on his shoulder. Clay said nothing but handed the boy his old knife, the one with the carved handle and dulled edge. "Yours now," he said. Edu took it without speaking, eyes wide. Ruth cried later that night. Not loud, not broken, just the quiet tears of someone who'd forgotten what steadiness felt like. "I don't know how to stay," she whispered. "I've only ever run." Mara, brushing Leela's hair beside the hearth, looked up. "You don't have to stay, you just don't leave yet." Ruth nodded and stayed. The days unfolded with a peace that felt almost dangerous. They built a smokehouse, planted squash and barley. Alma took to sleeping outside some nights, rifle close, her back pressed to the earth. Mara carved new figures, this time people. One looked like Clay, one like a girl holding a bird. One morning, a letter arrived, carried by a stranger on a black horse. It was for Mara. She read it twice, fingers trembling. Then she walked into the fields alone and stayed till dusk. When she returned, she told Clay, "He's alive. The child I left, grown now, east, working in a mill." Clay listened, nodding. "He doesn't want to see me," she said. "Only wrote to say he's alive, said he didn't blame me." Clay poured her coffee and placed it in her hands. "Sometimes living is enough," he said, "even apart." She sat beside him and drank slow. No tears, just silence. That night she laid her hand over his, not in need but in thanks. In late August the hawk returned. Not the same one, likely, but it circled low over the porch as Edu and Leela sat whittling whistles from willow branches. It landed on a fence post and stared at them, unblinking. Mara stepped outside, eyes on the sky. "I used to think the world was only what we survived," she said, voice low. Clay stood behind her, arms crossed. "It's what we build after," he said. The others joined them one by one, Ruth with Leela on her hip, Alma, shoulders sunburned. Edu holding a figure he'd carved from bone, a woman with a bird on her arm. They stood there in the long shadow of dusk, all of them quiet, not a family by blood, not by claim, but by choice, and in that choice something sacred. They didn't speak of the past much anymore, not out of shame, but because the present asked more of them. Weeding, mending, baking bread, holding each other upright in the hard moments and laughing in the rare ones. The land no longer felt like punishment, it felt like mercy, and that, at last, was enough.